The sonnet and sonnet sequence. The sonnet has been defined as a short lyric of 14 lines recited originally to a musical accompaniment. However, the length of a sonnet varies according to the requirement of the poet. Some sonnets are composed in 10½ lines and some in 16 lines also. The word sonnet is derived from the Italian word sonetto, which signifies a little sound or strain. The sonnet was in vogue in the 13th century Italy. The Italian poet, Giacomo da Lentini, is supposed to be the founder of the sonnet, and Francis Gattone da Ezza made some changes into the structure of the Italian sonnet. There was another form of sonnet in vogue in Italy called an occitan sonnet. Later on, Petrarchan and Dante established the sonnet and added beauty to it. Types of sonnet. The Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. The Italian sonnet comprises two parts. It opens with an octave which consists of two rhymes, ABBA, ABBA. The octave is followed by a sestet with two or sometimes three rhymes as CDE, CDE, or CDE, DED, or CDE, DCE. In the Italian sonnet, there is always a well-marked pause at the end of octave which is called as caesura. It may or may not be employed by the poet. The octave is followed by volta, which means turn in thought. In brief, it is redirection in the thought. The volta implies that the topic which is handled in the octave is given a different treatment by the poet in the sestet. The poet treats the subject in a novel way. In short, the volta separates the octave and sestet. John Milton's sonnets on his blindness and How Soon Hath Time are modelled on the Petrarchan sonnet. In On His Blindness, Milton has expressed his views on life and death, and in How Soon Hath Time he has given vent to his pent-up feelings of agony and pain. In another sonnet on the late massacre in Piedmont, Milton expresses his indignation and anger against the Piedmontese for having massacred the Vaudois. In all these sonnets, Milton follows the Petrarchan form of sonnet, and the tone of his sonnets is quite meditative and reflective. William Wordsworth also composed his Nuns Fret Not at Their Convent's Narrow Room, and The World Is Too Much With Us in the Petrarchan model. Both John Milton and William Wordsworth adapted the Petrarchan form of sonnet, which enabled them to employ a third rhyme in the octave and a volta in a later stage around the 10th line. The English sonnet or Shakespearean sonnet. The sonnet was born in Italy, and the Renaissance poets cradled it in their poetry, especially in England. It was alien to the English people. The sonnet was introduced to England by Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. They made some changes in its structure. But it was William Shakespeare who gave sonnet its real identity. He employed sonnet form so artistically that it is now named after him. The English sonnet has 7 rhymes as ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG. Henry Howard composed his sonnets in 3 quatrains followed by a couplet. The couplet carries the essence of the whole poem. The couplet completes the sense of the poem. The readers can find the poet at the acme of his poetic skill and imagination. In the first part of the sonnet, the poet deals with some universal question like life and death, friendship and war, love and hatred, etc. He completes the poem with a thought in the concluding lines. The couplet is pregnant with immense meaning. The Spenserian Sonnet. It is called as the Spencerian Sonnet because Edmund Spenser introduced a new metrical form of sonnet by making a few changes in English sonnet. In Spencerian sonnet, each part is linked with one another by rhyme. It is important to note that Edmund Spenser maintained the Italian restriction to 5 rhymes. The Spencerian sonnet has 5 rhymes as ABAB, BCBC, CDCD, EE. This form was dexterously used by the Romantic poets like Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats, and the Victorian poets like George Meredith, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. During the 20th century, Wystan Hugh Auden and William Butler Yeats also employed this form. Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias is a well-known sonnet, and John Keats also produced some sonnets as Bright Star, which is supposed to have been associated with Fanny Brown. There is also another minor form of sonnet which is known as curtal sonnet. It consists of 10½ lines. Gerard Manley Hopkins named it so and employed this type in his famous poems Pied Beauty and Peace. There is also a linked sequence of lyric poems, especially sonnets, which is known as crown of sonnets. In this type the last line of each poem is repeated as the first line of the next sonnet. In brief, the crown of sonnet is an Italian form of poetic tribute to some person attached to the poet. John Donne employed this form in his Holy Sonnets, and Sir Philip Sidney wrote a crown of dizen, a stanza of 10 lines, in his Arcadia. Sometimes, the stanza comprises 8 lines. It is a French verse stanza form. Difference in the Italian, English and Spencerian sonnet. The readers can find slight difference in all the 3 types of sonnet. Firstly, the Petrarchan sonnet has 2 parts, namely octave and sestet, which is not found in the English and Spencerian sonnet. Secondly, there is a link of the quatrains by rhyme in the Spencerian sonnet. Such linking is not found in the English sonnet. Finally, in the Italian sonnet, there is a volto at the end of 8th line, whereas the English sonnet has a couplet at the end. Sonnet sequences. The sonnet form ruled over every age except the Restoration Age and the early 18th century period. Though the sonnet was not employed on large scale because of the dominance of prose in the 18th century, it had its rule during the Renaissance, the Romantic Age, Victorian era, and even in the modern age. There were some poets who composed sonnet sequences which were full of melody and music. The poets connected the sonnets into a long sequence. They are also called sonnet cycles. The poets gave vent to their pent-up feelings through their sonnets, and they had subjective tone. Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella was written in 1582 and published in 1591. The work deals with Sidney's intense love for the daughter of Earl of Essex, Penelope Devereux. Sir Philip Sidney had intimate feelings for her. Astrophel and Stella unveils Sidney's longing for Penelope, his robbed happiness and despair, and hope. It also conveys the poet's conflict between honor and passion. Astrophel and Stella is written in Petrarchan form, comprising 108 sonnets with 11 songs. There is fine interplay of imagery, music and melody. Similarly, Edmund Spenser's Amoretti is also a sonnet sequence of 89 sonnets. The note of melancholy pervades the work. There is a fine blending of intense passion and charm of imagery. The sonnets deal with his wooing of Elizabeth Boyle, whom he married in 1594. This sonnet form is composed in the Elizabethan form, in which each sonnet concludes with a couplet. Another great poet, Samuel Daniel, who published his sonnet sequence Delia in 1592. These sonnets are greatly inspired by Tasso and the French poet, Philippe Desportes. Michael Drayton composed his sonnet sequence Ideas Mirror, which comprised 64 sonnets. Michael Drayton later entitled it as Idea. Henry Constable produced his book of sonnets called Diana in 1592. His sonnets are modelled on the poems by Philippe Desportes. Another renowned sonneteer of the period was Giles Fletcher, who composed a sonnet sequence entitled Lucia, or Poems of Love, in 1593. It is one of the finest and first sonnet sequences to tread on the path of Sidney's Astrophel and Stella. Fulk Greville's Coelica is laden with sheer beauty, and it is tinged with serious note. William Shakespeare's sonnet sequence contained 154 sonnets which were dedicated to his friend, a dark lady, and his rival, who was also a poet like him. Some critics opine that the friend alluded in these sonnets may be Earl of Southampton or William Lord Herbert. The dark lady mentioned in the sonnets may be Mary Fitton or the poet Emilia Lanier, and the rival poet is identified as Christopher Marlowe or George Chapman. But these are merely guesswork. In some of his sonnets William Shakespeare imitated Ronsard and Petrarch. It is said that to understand Shakespeare, one has to read and study his sonnets. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese is also a sonnet sequence which was published in 1850. It was a series of 44 poems. It is said that Robert Browning nicknamed Elizabeth Barrett his Little Portuguese on account of her dark complexion. The sonnet sequence deals with the poet's intense love for Robert Browning, her hesitation, and lastly, her submission to her love. It is said that the title of the sonnet sequence was deliberately chosen by Elizabeth Barrett in order to hide the name of the author. Dante Gabriel Rossetti has also produced his sonnet sequence The House of Life, which contains 101 sonnets. It is a sequence of 16-line pieces, each of 4 quatrains. The sonnet sequence deals with the theme of a breakup of marriage. Like her brother, Christina Rossetti also produced a sonnet sequence called Monu Innominata, Nameless Lady. It is addressed to Charles Cayley, the man she loved but did not marry. The sonnet sequence contains 14 sonnets. George Meredith wrote his sonnet sequence Modern Love, comprising 50 verses, which deals with the unhappy marital life of a couple, the disillusionment and separation of the two. Weist and Hugh Auden's In Time of War is also a famous work. Thus, many poets took delight in expressing their thoughts and feelings by using sonnet form. We can say that no other poetical form so widely and effectively used as the sonnet form in the history of English poetry. Its journey is long and interesting. Please subscribe Literature Guide.